What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be teaching you about Cultivate and Wait. What is it and how can it benefit your garden, and how can it greatly reduce your potential weed pressure that you might have in the garden? All that and more I'm going to talk about, so hopefully you guys are going to enjoy. If you do enjoy, make sure to throw a like up there. If you learned something new, let me know what you learned in the comments box below. And as always, if you did enjoy, make sure to subscribe if you have not yet already. I really appreciate it. And with that being said, let's go. So as the name implies, cultivate and wait really just means to turn the soil or work the soil in some way to change the conditions enough so that they are different from how they were before. So for instance, in this bed here, I had tomatoes, and I was growing the tomatoes for a full season. All the conditions that kind of were in place hadn't changed much. But once I pulled the tomato plants out, from that moment, the conditions changed. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to vastly change something in your garden. It could simply be opening the beds up to more sunlight by pulling out an existing crop. It could be, watering more frequently. If the bed is really dry and you water more frequently, that is kind of a type of cultivation by my definition. You're changing the conditions of the soil different from how they were. Cultivation back in the day would have been pulling out the rototiller and tilling up your soil. Now that is a type of cultivation. You're changing the conditions of the soil. You're aerating it. Aerating it is a change. So when you're changing the conditions of the soil, you're cultivating the soil. And what you want to do is you want to cultivate and wait. Now, why is that? Well, when you change the conditions of the soil, it allows for weed seeds that hadn't germinated or maybe wouldn't germinate under those existing conditions. Now that the conditions have changed, it may make conditions a little more favorable for them to germinate. So prime example is a lot of gardeners in the spring actually suffer from weed pressure because they till their garden, and that brings new fresh weed seeds to the surface. Well, originally they never would have existed or never would have sprouted because they were too deep down in the soil. But once you turned them up to the surface, they were able to access sunlight, water, the soil was warmer. They didn't have to push through, say, 6 or 7 inches of soil. They could push through maybe like a ½ inch or a ¼ inch or even an inch of soil to access the sunlight and start growing. That means their conditions changed to a much more favorable condition for weeds to germinate. Now, you might think to yourself, I don't want weeds. Why would I want to welcome more weeds in my garden? The fact of the matter is that as a gardener, there's always change out in your garden. There's always conditions changing. I don't aggressively rototill these beds here just because I changed out a bed from tomatoes to now garlic is enough of a change to allow for conditions to change and allow for new weed seeds to germinate. It also allows for things like tomato seedlings to start germinating as well. Volunteer plants can take advantage of those condition changes, and they can start germinating. Now, the worst thing that you can do is rush this process, pull out the tomatoes, and instantly plant something there right away. The reason why is because if I were to plant something like kale seeds or radish seeds right now, what could happen? Well, if I planted them out the day that I pulled out the tomato plants, and I raked this bed over, I added compost, I planted my kale seeds, I planted my radish seeds, what happens? Well, it has not allowed enough time for those weed seeds and those volunteer plants to actually germinate. So just like the plants that I'm planting from seed, my kale and my radishes, my spinach and whatnot, they're trying to germinate. So are the other weed seeds and volunteer seeds as well. So it allows for no time to pass to basically decipher what is what. You're basically just growing from scratch, just like everything else is. And the problem is that so many gardeners end up then combating a huge weed problem that sets their plants back because their young seedlings are competing against far more aggressive, far more competitive growing weeds, and they just simply can't compete. They end up suffering, they end up really being stunted, and sometimes might even be outcompeted and die flat out. I prefer to kind of cultivate and wait so that my whole bed is basically, anything that sprouts is unwanted, right? No matter what it is, it's unwanted because I have a different plan for this bed. So by cultivating and waiting, 100% of what grows here is unwanted. And so I can basically take a rake or I can take my hands and I can simply rake out the weeds. I can simply rake the bed clean. Or what I can do is I can get on my hands and knees, I can pull out those young weeds when they're still young, they don't have an established root system, they're very easy to pull out. I can pull out all the weeds, and anything that could germinate or would germinate will germinate in that week to 2 weeks or so. You have to make sure that you allow enough time for those things to germinate so that you're not causing yourself way more work in the long run. Imagine had you planted this out with those kale seeds, and you had your nice rows of kale seeds, and then all these other volunteer tomatoes start growing up, and all these other volunteer purslane and grass seed and anything else. Imagine all of them growing up with your kale. Well, then what happens is you're trying to pull out those weeds. The weed seeds are just about anywhere. You're trying to pull those out, and then what happens is you're displacing the kale. The kale is now being spaced out too far. Well, you're pulling out a kale plant here. Oh, I pulled it out, I got to plant it back. I didn't mean to pull that out. You're disturbing the root system, you're disturbing the spacing. You're actually pulling them out and maybe even killing those plants. Everything is a mess from day one. It's a mess from day one. And so many gardeners get discouraged by that, and they say, it's a mess from day one. How could I possibly have a successful garden if it's already a mess, if it's already ruined from day one? So you can set yourself up for so much more success by just cultivating and waiting, because that way all of this stuff that would have germinated, and then you can rake it clean, give it a chance to kind of settle out, plant it out the next day with no weed pressure at all, then plant your plants, and you might only have 5% of the total weed pressure compared to 100% of the total weed pressure. Hear that again. 100 plants could germinate, or 5 plants could germinate. We're talking weeds here. Would you rather weed out 5 weeds or 100 weeds? You're still going to, in total, weed out 100 weeds. But when you plant out the crops that you want to grow here, would you rather have to fight around 100 of those, or would you rather say, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, and there's one, no problem? It's so much easier to cultivate and wait. And that's what today's video is all about. It's not a long video. It's a simple one to understand. It's just that rushing things and being hasteful is not always a key to success. It's not always going to guarantee that you're going to grow more food in less time, because it might set you back. It might even cause you to have to replant, because after you did all that weeding, you might not even have any plants left that you originally wanted. You might have to weed everything just to start from scratch again. So now you've wasted time, and you wasted seed, you've wasted money, and waste is never good. Cultivate and wait. Another tip that I can give you in closing is that not to re-disturb the soil. If you have raked it clean, right? You've disturbed the soil once. Don't aggressively rake it the second time. Rake it just enough to rake out those weeds if that's your choice. Or, like I said, get on your hands and knees. Minimal disturbances to the soil are going to reduce the amount of conditional changes that exist, and that means that because the conditions haven't changed, anything that hasn't sprouted more than likely won't sprout, and you can simply go about your day and plant out your garden. Also, with things like watering, make sure that you keep the conditions the same so that, I haven't watered this bed, right? Well, if I go ahead and I water it, well, now the conditions have changed. Now the conditions have changed. So from day one, if you pull out your tomato bed, water it as if there was plants there. Water it as if there were seeds there that you wanted to grow. That way, when you actually do start watering your crops, you're not changing the conditions. You're not recultivating whatever is going to be there to germinate. Anything that could germinate, would germinate, and will germinate if you keep the conditions the same. Then if you don't change anything from that point, you could plant out your garden and you have way less weed pressure. So That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a like up there. Make sure to subscribe if you're not yet already. I appreciate your support. Make sure to tune in for next video. We're gonna be planting this bed out with garlic. I didn't have enough time today to do that. The sun is setting. I gotta head to the office and finish up some work. So I'm gonna plant out the garlic in tomorrow's video. Make sure you stay tuned for that. You're gonna love it. We're gonna talk about how to plant garlic. And so I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel reminding you to grow big or go home. And we'll catch you all later. See ya. Bye.